React server actions have been renamed server functions because they can be used for multiple purposes. Probably because a lot of folks were using them for queries instead of API routes. Is that a good idea? Well, let's find out as we take a look at the top 5 gotchas with server functions. All right, here's the starter project we're going to take a look at. It's called Server Function Gotchas. Of course, all of this code is available to you in GitHub for free, and a link in the description right down below. This is a NextJS 14 app router app, and it has shadcn input and button installed. So this isn't exactly a gotcha, but there are 2 different ways to invoke a server function. So we're going to take a look at both of those, and this should act as a nice little intro to server functions if you haven't actually tried them yet. Now, the first way to invoke a server function is to invoke it directly. So I'm going to create a new component in the app directory called direct. Now I'm putting that .server in there, not because it's required, but because it's a nice way when you have 2 components that are related to each other to say, well, this is the server part of it and this is the client part of it. So we're gonna have basically 2 components here, direct server and direct client, and they're gonna be really so interlocked that I just want to give them sort of one name. So in this case, direct. So we're gonna server part first. So this is a React server component. We know that because there's no use client at the top. And the first thing it does is it defines add numbers as a server function. So the 2 important parts are 1, that is an async function, and 2, that it's got that use server in there. Now there is a different way to use that use server. I'll show you that in a bit, but there are some downsides with that. Now this one just takes an array of numbers and then sums them up. So now this code also brings in this direct client component from direct client. So let's go and create that. And this will be a client component because that's how these things interact. A client component then calls the server function that's defined inside of a server component. So this direct client takes that server function as a property called add numbers. We then create some state for 2 numbers as well as the output result. We've got some input fields to input those numbers. And we've got a button. And when that button gets clicked, then we make a call to add numbers and we await the result because it is a promise. It is going out to the server and coming back. So it's an asynchronous function. All right, let's save these. And then I'm going to bring that into the home page. Now on the home page, I'm going to bring in the server component because the server component includes that client component. All right, let's bring it up in the browser. Okay, it looks pretty good. We've got direct client up here. I'll give it some numbers, 10 and 20, and then I'll hit add and we'll get 30. There you go. Pretty easy. Now, the other way to invoke a server function is with a post. You can use them as the target of a form post. So let's give that a try. I'll close these out and then I'll create a new file in here called with form. And again, I'll start on the server side. Now, when you have a server function that takes input from a form, the input is form data. So that's why data in this case is form data. So all we're going to do at this point is grab any keys out of that form and then put them into the console and we'll see what comes out. Now, of course, that brings in this client component. So let's go define that. And again, we'll follow with that .client convention. So in this component, we take that handle form data as a promise, and then we just add that as an action to the form. Let's give it a try. So I'll go back into my page and then I'll bring that in. Now let's try it out. All right, we got a cool looking form there. It's got 1 input field. I can type in some values. I hit submit. All right, now we can see that that console log popped up. We've got the name that we put in, and it's also got this action ID, and that action ID is part of the payload that's sent from the client to the server, and then the server with Next.js App Router and React 18 or 19 routes that data to the correct function on the server. All right, now those are the 2 general ways to interact with a server function. You can either call it directly or call it with a form. Now, this is all well and good for just posting something to the server, but let's say on the client, we want to get something back. We want some state returned from this form. We had that when it came to directly invoking that server function. Now we want to have it when it comes to this form. So how do we do that? Well, there's a new hook called useActionState. I wonder if that'll get renamed to useFunctionState. Now with this rename, I don't know, but it's with React 19. And it gives you a way to get state both into and out of both form-based server functions as well as direct server functions we saw before. So first thing I'm going to do is upgrade to 19. To do that, I'm going to go over to my package.json and I'm going to fix a couple of these versions. I'm going to change next to the release candidate as well as React and React DOM. And of course, that means removing all my node modules. Next. and then reinstalling everything. And I'll bring that up in dev mode. Okay, let's go over to our client, and then we can use that useActionState. So I bring in useActionState as a hook from React, and now I can wrap that form data handler with this useActionState. So useActionState takes a server function as the first argument, as well as the initial state, and then it returns to us a tuple that has the output state from the response, as well as a wrapped server action, and that's the one we're going to use for our action. But of course, it's got some issues with our type there. So what it's looking for now as a signature is the previous state, and I'm just going to put in there if we've submitted or not submitted. And then of course, the output of this function is also going to be that state. So there's our new signature, and it's happy with it. Of course, we don't actually put out that signature on the server, so let's go do that. So we'll just say that we're submitted true. Of course, we need to take in the previous state, but we're just going to ignore that. And now let's go back on the client and actually output that. And let's give it a go. All right, we can see they're currently not submitted. Let's go and put something in there, and we can see that now we are submitted. So you can get data into and out of that form-based function. Let's go try it out on that direct client and see if we can use it in the direct version as well. Now let's go back in the client for direct. We'll bring in that useActionState. We'll go and wrap that add numbers function. Of course, now the signature of add numbers is wrong. So let's change that. So now it takes a previous state, and the second argument is the values. We use that add number wrapped. Now the output of add numbers wrapped is a void, which kind of reminds me that we don't actually have to have a set result because the output of the add numbers wrapped is going to be that state. So let's just use that instead of the result. And that's it on the client side. Now let's go over to the server and fix that. So to do that, all we need to do is just add a previous state. Of course, we can use that if we want to. In this case, we don't care. Let's give it a try. 10 and 20, make 30. Awesome. Now to finish up our basic understanding of server functions, let's talk about where they can be defined. Because in this case, I'm defining them on the server component, but I don't actually have to do that. I can actually define them in another file. Let's take as an example, this add numbers server function. Let's go take that out. And now I want to put it into a new file called direct.actions, TS, doesn't need to be TSX. And that should work if I export it, right? So let's take it out of there, take it out of here, because we don't need that anymore. On the client, now we can just import that from actions. And now we don't need to take it as a prop. That's kind of cool. Let's hit save and see how we go. All right, now this is kind of interesting. So what it's telling us is that when we have not put it inside of a server component, then we need to have the use server marker at the top of the file. So let's take that out and put that at the top. And there you go. And it still works. Now, this is actually the first gotcha. The first gotcha here is that this use server pragma at the top of the file exposes every single function inside of this file as an exposed server action. So you really need to be careful when it comes to what you put in this file. Now, another potential here is that some code may actually leak out to the client in some circumstances. If you think that might be the case, what we want to do is bring in a new module called server only. And then you can import that at the top of this file. And this is a safeguard to ensure that none of the code in here is actually going out to the client. It'll blow up in dev time and you'll know that you have a leak. So that's a really handy tool when it comes to ensuring the integrity of the code base. Now that we know the basics of server functions, we know how to get data into and out of them. Let's talk about our first gotcha, which is monitoring the server function. How do we know if it's in flight? And can we put up some UI to say that we are actually processing? That monitoring is the first thing we want to take a look at. Now, one handy hook that we can use to monitor a server function in flight is useTransition. Now, when we invoke that useTransition, we get this tuple that says whether the transition is pending or not, and then a start transition function that we can use to wrap that server function, and then we'll know through is pending whether it's in flight or not. So we'll take that start transition, we'll wrap it around our add numbers, and then we can say disable the button if we're pending, and it'll put up a little pending there if we are pending. And of course, to slow things down, let's go and add an awaited interval. All right, we'll time out for a second. All right, let's give this a go. 30 and 40. We can see that we're pending, and then we can see that we got the result back. All right, now we know how to monitor our server functions. And notice we've been using server functions basically as they were defined before, as server actions. We're doing stuff against the server. Let's start talking about using server functions as queries and some of the upsides and downsides there. Now, the first gotcha there is that server functions are run serially. Let's go have a look. Now, in order to demonstrate how server functions are run serially, let me show you how API routes are run in parallel. So I need an API route, in fact, 2. So I'll create one called time1, and it will return to me the time that it was invoked after waiting around for 2 seconds. Now I'm going to go take that and I'm going to create another route that's exactly the same, time2. And now let's go create a client component that calls these 2 API routes. So I'm going to call that time with fetch. All right, this is going to be a very simple client component that uses useState to hold the times that we get back, as well as useEffect to launch the fetches. So down here, we can see that we have our 2 pieces of state for the 2 pieces of time, and we have our useEffect that runs this async function called fetch time. There are 2 fetches, one to API time 1 and one to API time 2. And importantly, because of that promise.all, those are run in parallel. Then we set those times and we output them. So let's go take a look at this on the page. And we'll get rid of the 2 previous examples and we'll show time with fetch. And now when I hit refresh, after 2 seconds, we get the time, and you'll notice that there's no delta between those 2 things. Both of those requests are made at the same time in parallel. So let's try the same thing with a server function. To start the server function example, we'll start off with the server again. So we'll say time with server function. And again, we'll implement on the server first. We'll create the time with server function server component, and then we'll create these 2 server functions, get time 1 and get time 2, which have exactly the same implementation as the API routes. So we're changing out calling API routes for calling server functions. Should be good, right? Well, we'll take those get time 1 and get time 2, and we'll send those off to the client component. Now let's go implement on that client component. So we'll create a new file, change that to client. Now, just like we did before, the fetch version, we're going to use useState to store the output of those time functions. We're going to use useEffect to invoke the, well, in this case, the server functions. So we need to take those as props, get time 1 and get time 2. Now, just like before, we're going to invoke them in parallel. So we invoke get time 1 and get time 2 in parallel, and we use await promise.all to await until both are done. And we would expect that the times would be the same. All right, let's go bring it to the page, and we'll give it a try. Now we can see that those API routes were run in parallel and the server functions were actually run serially. That's why you get the delta of the 2 seconds between server time 1 and server time 2. Now that's not the only downside when it comes to using server functions as queries. They're also only implemented as post methods. Let's take a look. So I bring up the network console and I hit refresh. We can see that we did the time 1 and time 2 API request, but we can also see that we hit that localhost twice. Those are for our 2 server functions. We can see that because down in the request headers, there's next action that says that we are invoking an action. And we can see that they're both run as post. And with NextJS and the app router today, as well as Waku, I believe, there's no way to say that a server function needs to be a GET request. Now, the problem with a post is that post is meant to be a destructive action. So you've got get for making a query, but you've got post, put, and delete for changing or mutating the state of the server. So by necessity, you're not going to cache post requests, either on the client or on the server or in your content delivery network. So if you're going to want to use these really awesome server functions as queries, but also get that caching, you're going to need some way to do that. Now in my course, pro-nextjs.dev, we go through all the basics of Next.js, but we also go into advanced topics like how to cache server actions. And we go step by step on how server actions work and how to cache them if you're interested in that. Now, they got you when it comes to server functions is they don't stream the response back. So let me show you what streaming is first using an API route where you can have a streaming API route, and then how you can't have a streaming API route easily when it comes to server functions. So to start out, I'm going to need something to stream. So I'm just going to create a little shell script here called count to 5. It'll be a little bash script. We'll make it executable. So it just counts from 1 to 5, but it sleeps for 1 second in between each iteration. So if you want to keep the user informed as to what's happening, you're going to want to stream the result back. So let's build an API around this. So over in my API directory, I'm going to create another route here called run. And it's going to export a get method off that route. It's going to spawn that count to 5 as a process and then camp on standard out using old school event listeners. And it's going to take that data back and export it as a stream that we then return as a next response. So that's how you do basic streaming with an API route. So that's kind of cool just like that. So now let's go check out how to call that on the client. So I'll create a new component here called streaming with fetch. Again, we're going to use useEffect and useState. The useState holds whatever's coming out of that API run. And then in the useEffect, we will call fetch on that API run. And then on the output, we'll call body reader. And that's going to give us a stream coming out of the body. And then we can slowly wait until that stream is completed and just build up that value. And then down below, we'll just format it. So let's bring that into the page. So add it in there and then we'll give it a go. And now I can see it's streaming back. Really cool, right? Actually, that's kind of neat just on its own. So there you go. You got some cool code that shows you how to stream responses back from a server. All right, now let's try the same thing with a server function. So I go back over to my app. I'm going to create a new file in here. I'm going to call this blocking run with function. And we'll do the server first. And now we can see that our server function in this case returns a promise. And in that promise, we're going to spawn again that count to 5. Again, we will camp on the events coming back from that and we'll build up this output string. And then when we close, we will resolve the output and that'll send it back to the client. Now let's build the client component. So we use useEffect again to launch it, but in this case, we'll use useActionState as we saw before and use transition to get the data coming back, as well as use transition to let us know that we're pending. All right, let's try it out. So we got our blocking run with function. We'll invoke that. Looks good, so we should have them both side by side. Let's give it a try. And now we can see that our run with function is still pending while our streaming output is streaming. Now I wish that at this time you could return a readable stream from run as opposed to that promise. Unfortunately, that's not the case at this time. Now I'm talking with Tanner Lindsley over at TanStack about their TanStack Start framework that supports server functions, and they actually do support readable streams in their server functions, but they have an entirely different implementation of server functions. It's definitely something we'll want to keep an eye on going forward. Now, there is one more gotcha when it comes to server functions that exposes not just what they can't do, but also something really cool that they can do. So let's take a look at how server functions can't support taking functions as inputs. So I'm going to call this example no functions. And here we'll start off with a simple server action that takes a first name and a last name and then returns a full name out of it. Now let's go create the client component for it. Okay, now this client component is going to take our server function as an input, and then it's going to have state for the first name and the last name, as well as the output name. The useEffect is going to call that make name with first name and last name when we get a change, and then we'll have 2 input fields as well as the output name. All right, let's bring that on our page. Okay, let's give it a try. Okay, let's change the names, and that's good. So that means that we're calling, that's fine. Now let's try, for whatever reason, to go and send in a function here. Now that's not part of the signature, but we'll just let TypeScript go there. And now we get an error, and the error is telling us that we can't send a function from the client to the server, which makes a lot of sense. But we can return functions from server functions. That's really interesting. So let's try that. So what it's telling us we could do is we could do something like this. We could go and turn that into a function. That's kind of cool. So let's try that. So back over here, it's going to turn us a function, which is a promise to a string. That's kind of neat. So let's get rid of this. And that's going to give us a function. And then we'll set name with the output of that function. Okay. All right, let's give it a go. Okay. All right. So now it's telling us we haven't defined the return function as a server function. So let's go do that. So down in here, we want to return that. So we change that around. So we return it, but then we also define that wrapper function as a server function. Let's give it a go. Okay, now it's telling us it needs to be an async function. No problem. And there we go. Now that's cool, but it's not really cool. So let me show you the really cool part. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to go create a new component here. I'm going to call it counter. The basic React counter. It's got a button. We've seen this a million times before. So let's go back into no functions. We'll import that counter. And I'll create a new server function called makeCounter that just returns the counter. This is crazy. Now let's take our makeCounter and send it over to our client component. Now we've got our makeCounter, but how we actually define that? Well, what it is it's a promise to return a React node. Now let's create some state to hold it. And you know what? Let's make it on a button. So I'll bring in button. And then down here, I'll have a button that says makeCounter. And then when I click on it, it'll call that makeCounter and set that counter. All right, let's take a look. Now I can click makeCounter, and that sent us back a counter. And we can use it as a client component counter. Now you can send back any combination of components you want. They can be server components. You can send back a table. You can send back client components like I did here, or you can send back any combination of those two things. Now, I hope that was a helpful intro to server functions and some of the gotchas around them, but also was inspiring you to use server functions because they really are very, very powerful once you understand their limitations. Now, some of you might not know that there's a podcast associated with the channel. It's called Front End Fire. There's a link in the description right down below. My friend TJ and Paige and I go through all of the week's front-end news. It is awesome stuff. Of course, there's also that Pro NextJS course that you should check out. There's a link to that also in the description right down below. If you like this video, hit that like button. If you really like the video, hit the subscribe button and click on that bell. You'll be notified the next time a new Blue Collar Coder comes out.